Hello everyone, this is Richard Sedano and I manage the U.S. program for the Regulatory Assistance Project, and thank you all for joining us today for this webinar, which is a conversation among Wrap principals, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the webinar in a minute, but first a few housekeeping notes. We are recording today's session, so you'll be able to share it or listen to it later, and we hope you'll do that. We have a lot of registrants, over 400, so we're going to keep the phone lines muted during the webinar. If you have questions, you can submit them through the GoToWebinar question panel, and we'll field those. And I want to thank the many of you who have already given us questions, so some of the time will be devoted to those. Following the question, the interview that I'm going to do with my colleagues and the question and answers, we'll have a wrap up, and that will take us to the top of the next hour, and we will that's the hour that we've scheduled, but we're going to stay on for an extra 30 minutes, kind of like some of the cable shows, some bonus time to take more questions and have more discussion until 30 minutes past the next hour. So with that, I'm going to introduce the panel. We have, that's me, wearing my NARIC outfit, and I'll be talking today with Ken Colburn, Dr. Carl Linvill, and David Littell, all principals, all former distinguished state public servants, and now with us at Wrap. Just a couple of things to say at the outset. There's a lot going on, as you all know, and it's really accelerated. And we focus a lot on the states and on the changing technology picture that's prompting many, many changes to the way we think about regulation and the way we think about customers and the way we think about the balance between regulation and markets. And so we'll be talking about that today. We'll be talking about the role of clean energy in creating an effective strategy for meeting society's needs, and how customers are going to be more important as a resource and not just as the consumers of utility service. And throughout all this, you'll hear a theme of innovation. Innovation is happening at all levels, and part of the challenge for regulation, frankly, is keeping up with it. So we have a lot to do, and I'm going to ask first David Littell to talk about what trends you see persisting in the power sector landscape into 2017.
Good afternoon, Rich, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. There are, I would point to, three trends that I think of as sort of as an ocean current or a prevailing wind. They're stronger sometimes than other times, and sometimes they'll ebb and flow, but they're sort of there. They were clearly there this last year, and they will be there for a number of years to come. The first is that consumers are increasingly driving power sector change. For years, industrial customers, large customers, have had the ability to pick their own technologies and generation and make a lot of their own energy decisions. But increasingly, smaller ratepayers, residential ratepayers, and small commercial ratepayers have that flexibility. So not just to pick supply, which they've had for several decades, but the ability to pick their own type of generation, even their own energy storage on site, and to increasingly determine where they want to go with their own energy resource decisions. This is posing a challenge to utilities, to RTOs and ISOs, and to state commissions that are only now beginning to grapple with what this means for the utility business model and for the rules of monopoly regulation and competition that we've developed over the last 100 years, or at least the last several decades, for competitive markets. And our previous regulatory regimes need to be re-examined in light of this innovation so that we can ensure that customers continue to get what they want for their energy dollars and what they think they're paying for. An example is aggregation rules. We have aggregation rules for some of the restructured markets the RTOs run, but increasingly we're looking at aggregation for things like utility operations and what it means to have a lot of distributed resources out there. How can they be used to facilitate grid reliability rather than be a challenge for grid reliability? So that was number one. Number two is that we're increasingly seeing the cost of renewable energy dropping. That includes the price of wind that now is only second to the price of energy conservation. It's still more efficient to save energy than to use it, but wind at the grid scale is now the most economical, followed by natural gas and grid scale solar. Oh, can we go backwards? There should be a quote from a regulator. I'm sorry, from a legislator. Yeah, great. This is a legislator, Republican legislator in Minnesota, who noted the changes that we see going on and analogized, you can tell this is an older person, analogized those to changes like moving from DVDs to VHSs. It's something that's just happening. And that really speaks to the economics part of it. We can do a lot, but basic economics and technological advancement drives a lot of what we do. So we'll come back to this this issue later in the webinar. And the third trend that I would note related to the first is that distributed energy resources are proliferating based largely on consumer preference. And they're posing the possibility of some really disruptive economic transformation for the utility business model. That's a little bit different than energy efficiency that we accommodated largely with decoupling in a lot of jurisdictions, but this poses other challenges, especially when you add in storage, the decreased cost of batteries, low-cost storage, and energy heaters, and other distributed forms of storage. So again, economics is always driving what we do, but policy clearly makes a difference on the edges, and state commissions are going to have to make the hard decisions. They can't avoid these on how we're going to change our rules for monopoly regulation and for market change. So with that, back to you, Rich.
David, thank you very much. Carl Linvill, how would you answer the question about trends persisting into the power sector in 2017?
Thanks, Rich, and hello, everyone. So in addition to the three that Dave identified that I obviously agree very strongly with, I would draw our attention to two more, and they are that the grid is getting smarter and grid operators are getting smarter. Information, communication, and system control technologies are getting deployed and used in a way now that's really different than previous time. For example, smart meters and advanced inverters are both giving better information to customers about their own consumption. They're also giving those customers options in terms of how they can contribute to the grid, and giving grid operators better situational awareness of what's going on the distribution system, and also the ability to control what's going on in the distribution system in a more refined way that, as a bottom line matter, means less curtailment on the distribution system. On the bulk electric system, an interesting example where modernization is already happening is with the Western Interconnection Synchrophaser Program, or WISP. WISP is a program that has led to the deployment of dozens of synchrophasers and synchrophaser concentration points in the Western Interconnection, which is creating better data accuracy, better data availability on a real-time basis. This allows system operators to anticipate problems before they happen or as they're happening in real time, and support the deployment of real-time controls that allows us in the Western Interconnection to move away from standard operating limits toward dynamic operating limits of transmission. On the other hand, these technologies, the deployment of the technology alone is not enough. We also need those who operate the system, both the bulk electric system and our distribution systems, to use these and to evolve their practices for how they manage flows on the electric system. They have the opportunity to provide benefits and improve distributed energy resource access, improved ability of distributed energy resources to contribute capabilities that can improve reliability, safety, and resiliency. A couple of examples where grid operators are already taking action that is leading to real benefits can be found. One in the PEAK organization in the Western Interconnection has implemented an enhanced curtailment calculator. Just to give you an example, this enhanced curtailment calculator allows management of real-time information. A recent analysis showed that the California-Oregon intertie, which is a very important intertie in the Western Interconnection, had a significant amount of curtailment. Had the advanced curtailment calculator been in place, 60% of that curtailment would have been obviated. And finally, another example is just in the deployment of the energy imbalance market in the West, as the California ISO and other balancing area operators in the West sync up their systems to allow for a 5-minute market between those who join the EIM. There's shared learning going on, much better information on each other's systems, which is improving optimization of resources, which is lowering cost and decreasing curtailment, both within the balancing areas outside of the California ISO as well as within the California ISO itself.
Thanks, Carl. Lots of things going on in the Western Interconnection. Ken Colburn, how would you answer the question about trends persisting into 2017?
Well, Carl and David have done a great job. I'd just chime in with one additional trend that I think is quite encouraging, Rich, and that is that the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner as coal units retire and they're replaced by renewables and natural gas. As this slide shows, that the numbers aren't in yet for 2016. Expect they'll be good, but 2015 showed that the lowest CO2 emissions from the power sector since 1993 occurred, more than 20 years. That's a level even below the levels set by the Waxman-Markey legislation that was proposed back in 2009. And EIA projects that there'll be continuing declines in the grid's carbon intensity going forward from here. This is all, of course, due to economics, not the heavy hand of regulation, and that itself is encouraging because it suggests increasing alignment rather than the conflict that we've historically seen between energy interests and environmental interests.
Okay, thanks, Ken, and the rest of you for that. I have another question for you, and it's about the direction of all of this transformation. There's a lot going on, but what opportunities do states, consumers, utilities, advocates, policymakers, all the different stakeholders have to support these changes in the most effective way? And Carl Linvill, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Rich. Consumers, I want to start with consumers. I think consumers are really central to the further evolution of the power sector. Consumers need to continue telling their utilities, their representatives, and their regulators what they want, what their goals are, what they want more sustainability, where they want their energy to come from, what they would like to happen in the power sector. Utilities, regulators, and policymakers, on the other hand, should be encouraging consumers, residential, commercial, and industrial consumers, to say what they want and to listen and try to help implement. The power system has the opportunity to become much more flexible and take advantage of a much broader range of resources just using today's technologies. So it's really important that utilities, regulators, and policymakers all support the institutional evolution that facilitates innovation. Evolution in regulation, evolution in laws, evolution in operational practices and rules. A couple quick examples where this transformation is happening. First of all, in some places, we're seeing the opportunity to expedite interconnection of distributed generation resources through better understanding of hosting capacity. Green Mountain Power is offering better information on hosting capacity. The California utilities are, of course, producing hosting capacity analyses. we have an opportunity to avoid distribution infrastructure investment through smart rate design that tracks temporal and locational price signals, and through the use of controllable loads like controllable water heaters. We have the opportunity to leverage regional resources with the introduction of improved market designs like the energy imbalance market that's already produced more than $100 million in benefits for consumers that participate in the EIM. And there's still work to do in the coming year. There's progress, but there's still work to do on attracting flexible generation and loads. With higher and higher penetrations of variable energy resources, attracting the flexible resources with transparent and energy price signals that fully reflect the cost on the system is really important to attract flexible loads and flexible generation to our electric system.
Thanks, Carl. Ken, what do you think about the opportunities for states and stakeholders to support all these changes?
Well, Carl's described a landscape that's basically overflowing with opportunities, but also challenges. And in such circumstances, the most important thing, I think, is to understand the fundamentals of the transformation underway. The power industry has managed a centralized supply-only system for over 100 years, but with today's information, networking, and technology developments empowering innovation, we're now technologically capable of managing electricity demand as well, as Carl alluded. It's just a matter of penetration of these technologies and not their existence any longer. If supply and demand can be both managed, that sounds like a genuine market. And a real market, of course, has profound ramifications for our business as usual regulatory structures. We witnessed great decentralizations in telephony and in computing, and it appears the power sector is next. So I think policymakers need to encourage technological innovation much as they do customer innovation, as Carl described.
Thanks, Ken. I want to change gears and talk about renewable energy for a few minutes, both grid scale and distributed level renewables. And David Littell, what's your outlook for renewables in the next couple of years?
Well, first, Rich, I'd look backwards. This last year, we have new numbers out from EIA just published that show that 24 gigawatts of new grid scale capacity was added. 60% of that, rather, about 2/3 was wind and solar, and that number ticked greatly upward in the last 2 months of last year, followed by about 1/3 of it natural gas, and far behind about 5% nuclear builds. I would expect that, and we can show that bar graph that we had up, that flashed up before, the other bar graph. Well, we'll go with this one. And this shows non-renewables versus renewable builds out over the last 6 years. And you can see this last year was a high point. I would expect with the production tax credit, investment tax credit ramping down a little bit that we would see the renewable numbers go down. But we'll continue to see that dynamic going forward. And then on the distributed side, we have solar continuing. That's grid scale solar. So we can go to, if you can find that other bar graph that used to be slide 6, I believe. That shows overall additions. On the distributed side, we'll see solar continuing to dominate. Now, solar development is driven by a mixture of factors, quite a few that have been identified. Excellent. That's the graph we're looking for. Those factors include consumer choices foremost, but also state policies on renewable portfolio standards, net energy metering, tax, and other incentives. And of course, energy price makes a difference because consumers will look to generate their own power if energy prices look different. So we'll see a variety of approaches across the states, with the topmost states being Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Oregon, and New York for solar development. Here you see capacity generations that are projected by EIA, and you see the yellow, which is solar, a lot of that between now and 2040, 2040 a lot of gas, which is blue, and a lot of wind projected, which is green. Those are continued to be projected to be the topmost, with a good deal of coal retirements, which are black, on the bottom side, which shows the capacity that's cycling off. So I'll close here by adding that it's not just there's a lot of complications for questions of rate design and how to get the balance right between and the equity right between different types of resources. But we also have economic stimulus that's happening. We had 100,000 jobs added, reported by the Department of Energy just 2 days ago. That increases employment in the electricity power sector by 13%, and the majority of that growth was in solar and wind, about 100,000 jobs in those two sectors alone. So we have a lot of economic activity being driven, and that's something certainly that policymakers are going to pay attention to. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Rich.
Thanks, David. Carl Linvill, I know that there's a lot of unrenewables going on in the West. How would you answer that question about the prognosis for grid-scale and distributed renewables?
Well, as David mentioned, and I believe you mentioned in your introduction, the price and performance of renewables has increased to the point where it's not really a question of the competitiveness of the technologies. It's a question of our ability to evolve how we use technologies. A couple of key areas where we're trying to make progress, and I hope we continue to make progress in the coming year and years, is in the ability of distributed energy resources to participate both in providing services on the distribution system to distribution system operators, as well as in the wholesale market. As David alluded to in the intro, there are a number of states that are addressing this issue and trying to expedite and smooth the way for distributed energy resources participating in markets. That changes the value proposition for distributed energy resources, potentially adds additional streams of value that can further improve the economics of these clean technologies. Also note, with Order 745 being resolved by the courts, the increased opportunity for demand response as one of those distributed energy resources to play in wholesale markets is very important, and has resumed making contribution in those places where it has an opportunity, and offers all of us the opportunity to make sure that it can contribute in all of our markets. Another trend is that, while policies still are very important, renewable portfolio standards and net energy metering have been very important facilitating mechanisms. It's now really the case that consumer preferences and markets are taking on a larger role in driving demand for clean energy. One case that I would cite is a recently announced project in Colorado, the Rush Wind Project, a 600 megawatt project that came in at 2.8 cents a kilowatt hour. The announcement of that project demonstrates that this makes that wind project competitive with a gas-fired power plant, a highly efficient gas-fired power plant operating at $3.19 a gas price over the entire duration of that economic analysis. I don't think very many of us believe that gas will stay or will be at that price over the life of a project. So wind is highly competitive, and customers in places like Colorado who are asking for more clean energy are driving utility choices to purchase more competitive renewable projects.
Great, thanks, Carl. I want to ask a question about the intersection between environment and energy regulation. Of course, we all want clean air, and we have the Clean Air Act to help us get there. And it's probably true that the power sector choices are going to influence how we get there and how successfully. So, Ken Colburn, I want to ask you about strategies to take advantage of the transformation of the power sector to achieve our air quality goals.
Sure, Rich. I think there are a number of strategies and processes, many of which have already been discussed this afternoon, that can point us in that direction. A good example of just how fast this transformation is occurring was brought to my attention by the Cooperative Finance Corporation and is illustrated in the pie charts. When EPA proposed the Clean Power Plan to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, it modeled what the fuel mix would be in 2030. And that fuel mix was actually achieved last August. The final Clean Power Plan rule was somewhat more stringent, and that's what's shown in this slide. And we haven't quite achieved that fuel mix, but we're close, and I wouldn't be surprised if we don't achieve it. I would be surprised if we don't achieve it by the time the Clean Power Plan nominally starts in 2022, let alone when it finishes in 2030. This suggests that carbon reductions are kind of baked into the market trends that are already underway. And this, of course, means the cost of reducing carbon will be far less than the historical abatement costs for the other traditional pollutants, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulates. This pace of change suggests a need for greater integration in energy and environmental regulation and planning, however. Wrap has given a lot of thought to how this might be done, and we've come up with a concept called eMERGE. This slide doesn't illustrate eMERGE, but it does show the Clean Air Act over the last 40 years has had remarkable achievements, and we really can't take away from it at all. It shows aggregate emissions of the most common pollutants dramatically down, even as gross domestic product and vehicle miles traveled and population, even energy consumption have all risen. So it's really done its job. But that also dates back 30 and 40 years, and times, as we've already discussed, are changing markedly. By regulating air pollutants piecemeal, one by one, coupled with the regular changes in standards that are required by the Clean Air Act, that's been frustrating for states and has led to unnecessary costs and inefficiencies. A more efficient method, we think, would be for state air and energy regulators to chart a comprehensive path to public health protection and pollution reduction by identifying and leveraging the lowest cost technologies and that will reduce pollutants in a multi-pollutant fashion, which is to say all at once. By integrating energy and air quality planning, states can leverage the pollution health expertise of the air regulators with the energy expertise of the utility regulators to get ahead of federal mandates and achieve the best possible outcomes for citizens, clean air and water, and affordable, reliable electric power. Although I think these dynamics apply to all states and utilities, I think they do create a special opportunity for electric cooperatives, a sector near and dear to my heart since I'm a member of a cooperative, because they're generally closer to their customers, who are their members after all, and because they typically have greater regulatory freedoms than investor-owned utilities. Thanks, Rich.
David Littell, you're a former energy and an environment regulator. How do you see the opportunities for the intersection between energy and environment regulation?
Well, there's a lot more we could do. The one point I would make here is that right now carbon and greenhouse gas control is very controversial. It's politically polarizing. But if you look at a lot of what Ken just noted, we can get huge reductions in the other pollutants, sulfur oxides known as SOx, nitrogen oxides, NOx, and particulate matter, that if you dive into the basis for the EPA cost estimates, one, you've got bigger benefits at stake. So you'll save more money, you reduce hospital admissions, you reduce premature mortality. And you know, as a former environmental regulator, I dug into those mortality figures. They're based on very solid analysis and studies that have been replicated across the U.S. When pollution levels go up, we know the mortality goes up. It's well documented. Those are actual, they're people that track that stuff and publish it in magazines known as Mortality and Morbidity Weekly, which are not commonly read, but the data is out there. So we know we'll save lives. We know that we'll reduce hospital admissions, and everyone is in favor of clean air. It's an absolute good. So that's an area where I think there can be a lot of commonality going forward, as we might agree to disagree on other issues. We can move forward with finding common ground there.
Thanks, David. And I guess one of the areas that is a source of potential common ground is energy efficiency. So I want to ask you, Carl Linvill, to talk about energy efficiency as a strategy for addressing some of these challenges, as well as perhaps to promote some social goals. What's the current energy efficiency landscape like, and what are the prospects for doing significantly more on energy efficiency than we're even seeing now?
Well, the title of our panel today emphasizes the word momentum, and I would just say nothing says momentum like energy efficiency over the last 40 years. This picture I've thrown up is not just the power sector, it's energy efficiency across all sectors. The red line shows what energy consumption would have looked like in quadrillion BTUs had growth rates persisted at the early to mid 1970 levels up through 2015. And below that shows what's actually happened since the mid-70s. It's really amazing what we've been able to do so far and how it has been sustained. You notice over the last 10 years or so of this, over the last 10 years, we've seen about 28% growth in the economy, and at the same time, no growth in BTUs of energy consumption. Pretty amazing. Part of the reason, next slide please, part of the reason is technologies and the standards that encourage the adoption of technologies. Here's just a slide showing what's happened with refrigerator efficiency over the last 40 years. Really amazing. But another part of the reason is state policies, not only the codes and standards policies, but also the policies that encourage energy efficiency. It's a fact that in 2006, just 3 states were achieving first-year efficiency standards of 0.8% per year. By 2014, that mushroomed to 18 states at 0.8% or better. And furthermore, by 2014, 2 states were at or above 2.5% savings, first-year savings per year. So, policies that contribute to this are, of course, energy efficiency programs, decoupling, incentives that align utility compensation with beneficial EE resources, and, of course, good measurement and verification helps. Good measurement and verification will continue to be important. But at the present time, energy efficiency is also being driven by a market momentum all of its own. Market momentum that comes from companies wanting to become more sustainable, from cities and counties adopting sustainability goals, from state governments adopting decarbonization or state government goals. Just a lot of people are coming into play asking how can I operate on a more sustainable way, and this in and of itself is driving energy efficiency as a complementary resource. Still, there's places to go. Next slide, please. If all states were to behave as the most energy efficient achieving states today, the 2.5%ers of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and a few complementary programs identified here that are identified in the paper that's shown on this slide, the next quantum leap in efficiency. 30% savings in the next 10 years is certainly a stretch, but there is a potential path forward with some technological innovation helping along the way.
Carl, thanks for that. Ken, do you have a short thing to add to that story about energy efficiency?
Sure, Rich. Just to reinforce, of course, efficiency not only helps manage the grid better and reduce ratepayer costs along the lines Carl described, but it's also effective in improving environmental quality. It's the ultimate reducer of all pollutant emissions, all water impacts, and so forth. So we've been frustrated for some time that why it is that environmental regulators haven't in fact been the leading champions of energy efficiency. And perhaps one root cause of that is that, at least on the air side, is that the Clean Air Act doesn't make it particularly easy for energy efficiency to count toward meeting state emission reduction obligations. Instead, it insists on the onerous measurement and verification that Carl mentioned. This is itself frustrating because over on the transportation side, EPA already allows emission reductions from millions of small sources to be readily estimated and applied to state emission reduction requirements. We call those sources vehicles. We believe that EPA can and should foster efficiency by applying a mobile source analogy to energy efficiency quantification so that emissions reductions from efficiency could be counted with similar ease towards states' obligations. Thanks.
Okay, Ken. And Ken, I wanted to ask you about an article that you had a role in about environmentally beneficial electrification. What is the importance of that?
I think this is going to play a bigger and bigger role, Rich. It certainly won't be everything, but it's the next big thing, I think. Basically, technology and market changes are making it possible today, even attractive today, to electrify traditionally fossil-fueled energy end uses. That's to say vehicles, space heating, and water heating primarily. And these changes also help manage and balance the grid. But meanwhile, of course, the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner over time with the fuel switching and renewable penetrations that we've mentioned. So as those devices are electrified and as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner, there's almost a compounding effect of environmental benefit. There will be some speed bumps along the way, of course, I'm sure. As with other transformational elements, policy will play a key role in electrification. The Clean Power Plan, for example, actually discouraged it because the reductions required were limited to power sector only emission reductions. Reductions from the transportation side or from space or water heating wouldn't count. So that's important to reconsider, and then some new metrics are also needed, notably ones delineating the overall emissions efficiency, not just energy efficiency of what measures are undertaken. We've nicknamed that emissioncy as a contraction like megawatts. So the emissions efficiency or emissioncy of measures will be important. And ultimately, the emissions and cost savings benefits of electrification will be a win-win-win for both consumers, utilities, and the environment. And that's why we at Wrapup are putting a lot of effort into this arena right now.
Thanks, Ken. What we're going to do now is turn to questions that have been coming in before we did this webinar today, as well as during the webinar. And so listen for yours. We have a lot more questions than we'll have time for, so you might not get to yours. The first question I'm going to direct to David Littell, and this gets to kind of the bottom line of many of these technology changes, is how can these changes in the energy sector lower infrastructure investment costs as well as improve air pollution?
Well, in terms of lowering infrastructure costs, we've already seen that. We've seen energy efficiency in New England result in cancellation of a number of bulk power systems, hundreds of millions of dollars that ratepayers in New England aren't needing to pay for. And just last week I saw an article in a California paper on the California ISO putting a bulk transmission project on deferral status because of the same thing, but this was attributed to solar generation reducing the peak in Northern California. So there's clearly opportunities for these new technologies, not just to serve consumers and provide consumer side value, but actually reduce overall system cost if everyone does their job the right way and focuses on reaching the best resolutions. And all of these technologies also reduce pollution because clearly renewables have a lower pollution profile, but increasing the efficiency with which the system operates also reduces overall pollution, and not just a small amount but substantially, with the pollution reductions that Ken Colburn noted before were national. But if you look at the regions that have been in the lead on these strategies, you'll see even more significant pollution reduction lines than those.
Linvill, do you have anything to add to that answer?
No, I guess the one area that I would add is on the distribution side of the system. Clean technologies on the distribution side, as we learn to take advantage of the information that we have and the better control that we have, the distribution investments that we'll need to make are going to really be different than previously. Some distribution investments will be avoided, but granted, some new distribution investments will probably also be needed. But clean energy on the distribution side goes hand in hand with improved efficiency of investment on the distribution side.
Thanks, Carl. And next question I'm going to direct to you, and that has to do, we've talked about end-use energy efficiency, but there's a lot of potential for efficiency on the supply side of the meter, on the utility system. So how do we move towards getting better efficiency results on the supply side of the meter?
Well, I guess I gave an example of this in the presentation of the deployment of synchrophasers, the Western Interconnection Synchrophaser program, which allows real-time information, which I mentioned that it has the ability to transition us away from static operating limits to dynamic operating limits. It also means that we have the ability to manage the system in a way that reduces line losses and reduces curtailment. So I would just cite that as a good example of improving efficiency on the supply side of the system.
Thanks, Carl. And I'll just add that I think that we're going to start thinking about performance standards that might motivate utilities in that direction. So, Ken Colburn, we have a question here about the municipals and the cooperatives. A lot of times we have these conversations and we lapse into thinking that we're just talking about the investor-owned utilities. But how do the public power sector members in the municipal and cooperative communities manage all of these technology trends that we've been talking about today?
Well, this is a really good question, Rich, and as you would anticipate, because those utilities are generally smaller, they may also have less capacity to keep abreast of and adapt to the kinds of changes that are underway in the sector. And make no mistake, of course, the technologies and opportunities that will apply to the grid, to customers, to the entire distribution system that we've already discussed today will certainly apply to munis and co-ops as well. So I think that there are multiple approaches, pretty much responsibility shared by everyone. It's incumbent on munis through APPA to keep abreast as well as they can and participate in those proceedings at APPA, and for co-ops to keep up to date with their national organization and our ECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And I think from a state perspective, what can state regulators do? Even though they often have less regulatory authority in terms of state statutes over munis and co-ops, because they have their own governance through other provisions, they can still include munis and co-ops in deliberations, in education sessions, in tech sessions and so forth, so that at least they're welcome. Hopefully we'll take advantage of those opportunities to understand what's going on in the state and more broad market areas. Those at least provide a start for munis and co-ops.
Thanks, Ken. David Littell, do you have any thing to add about what state government can do to help public power entities embrace these trends for the benefit of their members and customers?
No, I would just reemphasize what Ken said. I think he hit it right, and Ken's got a lot of familiarity with that sector.
Well, Carl Linvill, I know in California and a few other states, consumer aggregation is emerging as a force to declare what customers are looking for, which is perhaps another expression of public power. How do you think that's going to influence the changes in these trends in those states that are allowing or even encouraging consumer aggregation?
Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about any kind of a mechanism that encourages customers to have a voice and provides a vehicle for that voice being expressed and acted upon. I know utilities in many places in the country are very interested in improving their customer engagement approach, and I'm excited about that. I'm also excited about places where communities are taking on the job of aggregating the customers within their community, honing sustainability policy that aligns with what the people in that community want, and communicating that to the marketplace and meeting that in new ways. You're referring most directly, I think, to the community choice aggregation option in California, and that's certainly a good example. There's also communities, cities, progressive cities around the country who are joining hands with the large commercial customers in their communities, with residential customers, and their own city operations, and trying to figure out, how can we together meet sustainability goals and work with our utility to work towards the cleaner energy future we want.
Great, thanks, Carl. So here's one of the big questions that Wrap very often is dealing with when we're working with states, decision makers. What barriers need to be removed to enable utilities to meet customer needs for a wide array of energy products and services? So this is how regulation is perhaps in the way, perhaps can be moved out of the way while maintaining the public interest in all of the important safety nets that regulation does. So, Carl, I'll start with you and ask all three of you to answer this.
Could you restate the question real shortly?
What barriers need to be removed? What barriers need to be removed to enable utilities to meet customer needs for a wide array of energy products and services?
Well, the first thing that always comes to mind in me. I mean, there is the whole situation of understanding better what's going on the distribution system. Just because of limitations of the information that we've had in previous times, and the lack of granularity of that information on a locational and temporal basis, we've had to, and distribution system operators have had to manage their system in a very conservative way to protect safety and reliability. Encouraging much better real-time information on the distribution system leads to the possibility of identifying in a more specific way where there is open space on the distribution system where additional distributed generation can be added, where concentrated vehicle charging can be accommodated at low cost. Can identify where on the system well-placed storage can obviate the need for more expensive transmission system or distribution system upgrades. So I guess, you know, the first barrier is getting the information on the system. The second barrier is progressing towards using that information to usefully communicate to customers and developers what resources are beneficial where on the system. And then the third part of that is communicating that to customers in a way and providing the value propositions to customers that drive cost-effective investment on the system through customer choice.
Thanks, Carl. David Littell, what barriers are foremost in your mind?
Yeah, I agree with Carl was focusing on the granularity of the information and the estimates, both in planning but also operationally. What I would add to that is a different perspective. I think that the basic utility model is still based on revenues being generated by investments in rate base, and that model the model that's developed over the last 100 years. It has been a valid model, but increasingly it has a possibility of driving investments that just aren't good for ratepayers, an incentive to invest in big infrastructure rather than these new technologies that can reduce overall system costs. So I think to remove that barrier, we need to think more in terms of rewarding performance for the utilities and less on just rewarding their size and the size of their investments, and that includes rewarding excellent performance very well and giving utilities an incentive to do things like sharing data that third-party market providers who are really competitors in a certain sense with the utilities want, and to encourage a monopoly business like a utility to share data. Realistically, you need to incentivize them to do that. There's no other way to do it. So I think we need to think much more in terms of not just making performance incentives a thin icing on top of the cake, but ways to make it the cake. And reward excellent performance for those utilities that are doing an excellent job serving their ratepayers and providing the value that ratepayers increasingly are demanding.
Ken Colburn, anything to add?
I think I do, Rich. David and I weren't passing notes under the table, but he came very close. Your question said to help utilities, and it occurs to me that the focus should be on customers and technology adoption, not in gaming the system, advantaging utilities as the business model changes from a natural to a competitive marketplace. Regulator and states responsibility.
All right, Ken, something's happened to your audio. We'll be checking that. Carl, I want to ask you a question, the last question before we get to the top of the hour, and I'll remind everyone that we're going to stay on until half past the next hour to do more questions. But the last question for this top of the hour has to do with the potential to balance the grid with large-scale renewable energy, the kind of work that National Renewable Energy Laboratory is doing to demonstrate very large shares of renewables being able to be integrated into the grid under the right conditions. And the question has to do with how to improve the understanding among decision makers, especially in government and utilities, that integration of large-scale renewables is feasible. Carl, what do we do to connect what we think we know about the grid with what actually is true?
Well, I think we tip our hat to the leaders, the people that step forward, the utilities, the utility commissions that step forward and take the observation that it wasn't very long ago that it was popular belief that no more than 5% of the grid could be operated with renewable energy. It's now common to talk about 30–40% of the energy on the grid being supplied by renewable energy, really over not very a long period of time, just 10 years really, or 15 years. The common knowledge of that has changed. I think that rightly the people who operate the system, the utilities, the distribution operators, as well as the regional operators, are concerned about safety and security, and they're being asked to really evolve how they operate and use information that they haven't had at their disposal before. So I would say it's a combination of patience and encouraging those who are going forward to be aggressive and to figure out, conceptually, the work of NREL shows that very high percentages of our energy needs can be met. 60–80% of our energy needs can be met with renewable energy. There are system evolution steps that need to happen in order to get to that place. And so this is not necessarily an easy problem, but it's a doable problem. And I just think the right combination of driving forward hard and patience that we all have to learn are the key to beating those very high clean energy futures.
Thanks, Carl. Yes, I think becoming more facile with some of these models is going to help us appreciate what's possible. So we're going to just wrap up a few key messages up to the top of the hour, and then we'll continue for another 30 minutes with a few more of your questions. And to start our brief wrap-ups will be Carl Linvill.
Thanks, Rich. So I guess my takeaway message from this conversation is that clean energy has a powerful momentum all its own at this point. But that momentum is fueled by the actions of many people on the state and local level, and there's no reason to believe that that won't continue apace or even increase. Utilities are interested in grid modernization and improving operations, and in understanding what customers want and engaging with them. That's a good sign. Third parties are introducing customer services that haven't been offered before. They're offering new ways of leveraging information technologies and data analytics, and they're exploring ways of collaborating beneficially with utilities, and that's a good thing. Companies are adopting sustainability goals, evolving operations to improve efficiency and sustainability, and are exploring self-provision of renewables. Cities also are adopting sustainability goals, I guess cities and other governmental bodies, counties. They're walking the walk with their own properties. They're collaborating with utilities and local businesses to extend those goals beyond city property alone to the footprint of their entire city. Clean tech companies continue to evolve the technologies. We haven't talked much about storage today. In fact, we've talked almost none at all, but another very important technology that's moving forward and down the cost curve is storage, and achieving scale and scope of technologies. Again, innovating in partnerships with customers, utilities, the national labs is really important. So where does that leave regulators and state policymakers? Well, regulators and state policymakers set the table. They lay the policy and regulatory foundation that can support innovation and initiative by each of the above players if they do well. Understanding what people want, what each of these players want, is more important than ever. If we're going to evolve the service option flexibility and create the transparency in system needs and flexibility in system resources that we need to meet those needs.
Okay, Carl. Quickly, David Littell, can you wrap up your thoughts?
Sure. I just reemphasized that customer empowerment is critical, and utility regulators can either enable this market transformation to more customer empowerment or stultify it. And I think if we, we advise a lot of them, a lot of the regulators and the policymakers, and if we help them get it right with changing the market rules and changing the nature of what they do as regulators, then these issues won't end up back in front of them in their legislatures every year. And if we get it wrong, they'll be constantly needing to revisit, and that'll really be a failure. So the focus should be on trying to, to use a river analogy, get the diking right and build the dike where you need it, maybe to protect low-income consumers for equity reasons, but also be aware that whenever you build a dike, you're going to put forces somewhere else in the river, and you can't always predict where that is. And if regulators get our job right, we'll get the system and the river flowing in the right direction. Everyone will benefit.
Thanks, David. Ken Colburn, your closing word?
Yep. Hopefully my audio is a little better now. I'm not sure what caused that, but it's clear at this point, Rich, that energy efficiency has been joined by renewable energy as an effective low-cost strategy for reducing emissions as well as costs, deferring unnecessary infrastructure investments, and producing multiple electric system customer and public health societal benefits. The fundamental transformation that's underway will be a technology-driven metamorphosis to a market economy in the power sector. This will enfranchise innovation and opportunity as never before, but it won't necessarily be a smooth path. Utilities will face the challenge of formulating new business models, but I think that policymakers may have to do the same as well. Wrap's emerge process may be a step in that direction. Also, the Clean Power Plan's requirements are likely to be met by that marketplace, probably even before it starts. And beneficial electrification will flourish and redouble those cost savings and health benefits. I think we're living in those interesting times that the proverb calls for.
Well, my closing idea is about innovation, and I enjoy from time to time speaking with people in university, college, and grad school about how exciting our business is going to be to enter now. I might not have been able to say that quite the same way 10 years ago. With that, I'm going to bring our primary webinar to a close. I appreciate everyone who's given us an hour, and if you're inclined to stay on for another few minutes, we will address some more of your questions. And I'm going to now pursue a few more questions. And I'm going to start with one that has an international take to it. What is the trend of power sector reform in other developing countries? The questioner specifically identifies China, India, and Mexico. So I'm going to ask Carl to talk about Mexico, since he's been doing some work there for us, and I'll say something about China and India.
Well, Mexico has established some great aspirational goals, some renewable standards. As many of us know, they have taken steps toward restructuring what was previously a nationalized utility into one that has a number of pieces that are seeking to provide more options and competitive choices, seeking to empower commercial, industrial customers and meet customer needs. And they're considering, many of the same things that we're talking about along the way. They're talking about regionalizing. For example, they're talking about potentially one of the control areas of Mexico potentially joining the energy imbalance market. They're talking about the participation of customer resources in meeting wholesale needs, for example, through demand response participation. They're talking about renewable development options towards meeting their 30 or 35% goal. I can't recall which it is. Yeah, they're talking about grid modernization. They're thinking about both on the customer side of things as well as the grid. spending on smart grid investments that can improve efficiency, access renewables, and integrate the higher levels of variable energy that they're seeking to get.
Great, thanks, Carl. And I'll just note in Mexico that there is a tremendous leadership coming from elected officials from both their recent laws and the position of the president. And in China and India, there is equally high prioritization for energy. Each of these places is, of course, very different, but both of them are trying to make better use of markets, and we sometimes think of China as a totalitarian place, but in fact China makes tremendous use of market forces, even though they have a state-owned grid and power generation. They do set the different units of them against each other to compete, and there is a tremendous amount of development in clean energy, perhaps motivated by air quality, but perhaps motivated by strategic concerns. And meanwhile, in India, over the last several years, they have realized the tremendous potential they have for developing renewable energy, and so our work there is focused on helping them with that nationally, and we're starting to spend more time with a few of their states on the same. I'm going to now ask a question about storage. Carl bootstrapped storage into his summary, but I wanted to ask Carl and David to take a somewhat more deliberate consideration of the prospects for storage to come into the power system in the next couple of years. Carl, why don't I start with you to finish the thought that you had, and then ask David to go.
Okay. Yeah, you know, I think storage, first of all, we have to talk about the definition of storage. You know, people often jump to the thought that storage is a battery. And of course, there are many kinds of storage, and controllable loads on the customer side can look just like storage for some services. So I would say that to be very brief here, I would just say that our electric system has evolving needs on the distribution side and on the bulk electric system side because of variable energy resources. Jim Lazar, one of our esteemed colleagues, has done a really fabulous job showing that with a little publication called Teaching the Duck to Fly, where he showed how a number of technologies, including controllable load, kind of thermal storage like water heaters, along with battery storage, can help to meet the load variability challenges on the distribution system. So I think storage is very important, and I think the costs of storage are coming down, the costs of batteries are coming down, but the costs of some controllable loads that can behave much like storage is already pretty low and can be accessed to improve reliability and ensure reliability with more distributed generation on the distribution system. I'll hand it over to David.
Thanks, Carl. What I would add, if sort of not obvious, is that storage can operate at a lot of different levels. It's unique in that regard, and even the various FERC decisions recognize that in some cases storage can act and look a lot like a generator, so it can produce energy and have capacity value. In other cases, it can be a transmission, a bulk transmission facility asset, and look more like a bulk transmission enabler. And then at the distribution level, it obviously has distribution value as well, and is being installed by a number of utilities at their substations to realize that value. And so a lot of different characteristics that that challenge the way that we've thought of any one resource before. It simply doesn't fit in any of the pegs that we have, or any of the holes that we have. It's got a lot of capacity. And right now, given the current availability of the markets and the rules, its greatest value is on the consumer side, to reduce demand charges for commercial entities, for instance, or to provide reliability and resilience value for other customers. And so all of those values, what we need to do is be thinking about how we can realize those values in one area without losing them in another. And so an example of what it would look like to lose them is if an RTO has a capacity market rule that says you can come in and get qualified in the capacity markets for storage, and they could call it a demand response, they could call it a generator, whatever they call it, but then you can't participate in any retail markets, and we need to have 100% of your capacity available 24/7, 365 days a year. That's not an efficient outcome. And as we look and get more experience implementing different storage technologies, we'll realize that there are ways to use statistical methods and ways to create load profiles based on experience or projections for how resources are going to be used, or actual contractual commitments that can allow us to realize the customer-sided values, the retail-sided values, and some of the wholesale values, and really maximize the potential for this resource.
Rich, this is Ken. I could offer a couple other examples as well, if time permits.
Go ahead.
Carl mentioned the storage is already here, particularly in the form of energy services, and a couple of things that Great River Energy, a generation and transmission cooperative in Minnesota, have done is working with a local cooperative, distribution cooperative. It offered a deeply discounted solar panel to members, but the catch was they had to also take a brand new water heater. That water heater, of course, was grid integrated, and the variety of customers that did that, I forget the total number, enables Great River to not only peak shave in the traditional hot water shaving sense, but also to provide ancillary services by tailoring their load. A second thing that they've done is enable electric vehicle owners to charge their vehicles at night for free because of offtake agreements with wind power generators seeking the production tax credit. So that's another form of storage that's underway in the upper Midwest here now today.
Thanks, Ken. Now, here's a pretty provocative question, and David, I'm going to ask you to address it first because I have supreme confidence in your sensitivity to address this question. How can we help utility managers understand the urgency of necessary change? And then there's a comment. So this is the questioner's comment, not Wrap's comment. Too many utilities are stuck in wait-and-see mode.
Yeah, good question. I mean, utilities, because they operate within the system that we've created for them, are really somewhat reactionary, right, and conservative and risk averse, because if they take a big risk, they can't reap the benefit the way that competitive enterprises elsewhere can. We like to limit their rate of return to something that we deem reasonable, but it's nothing that an investment banker would be happy with. So we don't incentivize risk-taking behavior, and that filters down through the utilities, and it's a rational business model. That's what we've encouraged them to do. So I think part of the answer to that question is that regulators, and probably in discrete areas, need to consider if we really want to incentivize experimentation in a particular area, such as encouraging and looking at storage and using storage to integrate distributed resources, in particular distribution level solar or smaller community solar. A number of utilities are looking at that. We need to allow a safe space for the utilities to invest, and there are a number of ways to do that. One way is to protect their investments and not penalize them for a failure of that investment to work out. Another way is to provide some amount of state subsidy, and I've seen that model in different states, and that's really engaging with them. But the foremost area is to engage with them and create stakeholder groups that are public and transparent to get different stakeholders from different areas, including the the competitors, that's the third-party energy service providers, to work and identify the issues and the fixes that would work.
Thanks, David. Ken Colburn, do you have an answer to this question?
Well, not really, Rich. I think David covered it very well, except for one other area. I think that you know, time of use rates, the variable cost of energy over the course of a day and season, has been camouflaged, and so the more commissions can work toward real market dynamics in what is increasingly a real market, I think could also help both utility managers and the policymakers that oversee them.
Well, Linvill, I want to give you a chance to address this.
Hey, thank you. I think the one thing, David gave a great answer. But the one thing that I've been thinking about lately that I wish we would all think about is that utilities are not a monolith. They're complicated organizations that have different groups with different objectives within the organization, and probably when we interact with utility, rather than seeing it as one thing, we need to see it as an ecosystem, and we need to spend a little more time understanding the internal dynamics of the utility. You know, what's really standing in the way. I think a lot of the things that David identified are, you know, are key candidates for what's standing in the way. But I think that I've been calling throughout this discussion for the utility doing a better job listening to customers. I also think regulators and advocates, all of us, need to do a better job of understanding and listening to the utility and how the internal dynamics are affecting their ability to change.
Thanks, Carl. I can't resist a couple of thoughts here that are still unsaid, and that is my general feeling that government must lead in these transformations, and that creating a sense of inevitability and a sense that the utilities' role and need to be compensated for that role will be respected. And I think the biggest challenge in this, frankly, is the fishbowl that all of us work in, the sense that if there's somebody that screws up, there's somebody else ready to say gotcha. And it creates a challenge to allow failure to occur. I think many of us in this world are thinking we have to try things, we have to be willing to experiment, and that becomes a challenge in a gotcha environment. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to go to a question that I think I'm going to direct to David Littell. It came from a New England person in state government, and asks about whether we should be encouraging or expecting multi-state or regional strategies, not just focusing on what individual states might do from state to state, but how can we help groups of states perhaps make progress together?
Good. That's a good question. Obviously, I spent a good deal of my time as a public official working on that. And what I would say is whether a multi-state initiative can succeed really depends on the nature of the subject matter. So Reggie worked. That was part of the ingredient there, was a strong commitment from the governors at the time to make it work, and also sort of common economic interests. It's very hard in some areas when you have different players in different states pushing in different directions, but there's certainly a number of models on the environmental side. One that jumps to mind is mercury reduction, so in a generally non-energy related area, but where there's very successful efforts spanning the international boundary between the Canadian provinces and states to make multi-state initiatives work, largely based on sort of a good idea model and leadership by example, to pick Rich's idea, except that it involved a lot of private sector initiatives. So it really depends on thinking, sort of a commitment at the legislative level and the governor's levels in some cases, and or some initiatives that can be done because they're simply good ideas, and good ideas will spread. And a number are jumping to mind, but I hesitate with our time limitation to put them forward. And there's some areas where I can think of where you just have such different disparate interests. It's very difficult to reach a common approach. So I'll leave the answer at that.
Okay, Carl, would you like to add anything to that since you're focusing on the West a lot?
Yeah, I do agree that I think, you know, a number of the solutions that that we need in order to achieve a cleaner energy future involve multi-state collaboration. So establishing those communication lines and collaborating and encouraging governors and state legislators and regulators to collaborate, you know, is actually essential in the West if we're going to be able to support cost effectively the high variable energy that we'd like to be moving towards.
Great, thanks. So here's a provocative one, and I think I was hoping that we wouldn't get asked this question, but we did, and I'll let us field it to the extent we want to, and that is an invitation to summarize our advice to the incoming administration. And one thing that I'll say is that I think that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is largely on a track of creating a balance between regulation and markets that isn't very partisan. Perhaps we'll see a FERC that's more interested in infrastructure than we've seen lately. But I think that my advice to the feds is to recognize the importance of what's going on in the states and to support the states in doing what they're doing, and recognizing that a lot of the big innovation is happening at the states. There is talk of some sort of infrastructure initiative, and I think there's a tremendous amount that could be supported in terms of distribution utility and customer-facing investment that the federal government could support if it does some sort of package like that. Do any of the others of you want to share your unsolicited advice to the federal government?
Rich, this is Ken. I would, I think that's a good way to frame it, and I would add simply that I think the technology and information networking trends that are at the root of a lot of the current transformation really mean that it will happen anyway, and the new administration, I think, can try to discern whether they want to make that harder, slow it down, or make it easier and speed it up, but they probably need to recognize that they can't prevent it, and hopefully wouldn't want to. At bottom, I think when one looks at the numbers, more of our energy dollars stay at home, creating more jobs as a result of these technologies, and that is something that I would anticipate that any administration would want to support and foster.
Okay, do either of the other of you want to say anything about this?
Well, I have a quick one, which is just the national security implications of clean energy. That I would hope that the new administration would listen to the people that think about national security and think about a vulnerability that we sometimes face in importing a large amount of renewable or a large amount of energy into our country, and the benefits that can be generated to our security in becoming more self-sufficient with resources that are cleaner and homegrown.
Yeah, and I would just add, picking up on where Carl left off, that the whole area of cybersecurity And the exposure of our utilities is really an area where we need a lot of experts and a lot of thought to go into. The traditional governmental way. I was also, in my background, an intelligence officer in the Navy Reserve, and the way that our government entities approach this issue tends not to trust sharing critical information with utilities. You know, they've got good national security reasons to want to do that, but it makes it very hard to solve problems when the ones that are actually operating the systems can't see a lot of the critical information on threats that's coming through. There's a real disconnect there, and NERC obviously is on the forefront of looking at those issues, but we're not really well situated to address the fundamental challenges, and there are a lot of them. We can't stop sort of the web-based information revolution that's going on now, but it is opening up a lot of our infrastructure to challenges that a lot of people in the industry don't fully understand yet.
David, I want to follow up. We did get a question that asks, are there areas where investment in cybersecurity can enhance or hurt the transition to clean energy? Any sense of how they're related, or do you think they're just parallel topics, not really interacting with each other?
Well, I mean, it's complex, right? I hesitate on such a complex area to offer simple solutions, but you've got those who don't want to move forward with grid modernization. You risk using it as an excuse not to move forward, which is foolish because it is moving forward. So not engaging and moving forward is not going to solve the problem. It's something you need to engage. It needs to be engaged in both by utilities and by those looking to share the information. But there's simple questions of protocol standards, which our national standard setting bodies need to look at, and there's things like programming and common interfaces that can be taken into account. And then there's your average appliances that are available, things as simple as that might not always incorporate the best technologies, and risks either compromising customer information or worse, the system, an entree to the system itself. So it's an area that requires a lot more attention, but careful, thoughtful attention, and it's certainly not an area that's helpful, or it is ripe for scare tactics, but that's not helpful at all to solving the problems or meeting the challenge that's in front of us.
So a problem-solving approach should accommodate sufficient cybersecurity and plenty of room to develop clean energy.
There are good commissioners that are working on it. I know in my area of the country we've got a commissioner from New Hampshire and a commissioner from Maine and a former chairman from Connecticut who are very active in the area. So we've got some people that are working on it, but a lot. We're only starting.
So there's a question about the New York REV process, and this will probably be the last question, and I'll probably just take this one so you guys can relax. So the question is, generally speaking, does the New York's Reforming the Energy Vision process and the sweeping reforms included bode better for energy efficiency and solar than targeted incremental policy change? This is a really interesting question. For those people who have been following the New York REV process, as it's called, it is promising to really activate customers and fully value customer resources and change the role and mission of the electric utilities. And I think a short answer to this complicated question is that certainly a adherence purely to markets probably is a risk to energy efficiency and a risk to solar. But I think the way REV is going at it, which is, I think, a strong sense of market orientation leavened with a strong sense of public policy, is going to, for energy efficiency, create, I think, a floor for energy efficiency outcomes, and then opportunities for utilities to be motivated to do more than that. And as for solar, The value of distributed energy resource case that's still underway, I think, is where the solar issues are going to get played out. And my belief is that the folks in New York want to maintain a vibrant solar industry and are going to try to figure out how to do that and grow it. But I think there's a fair chance that net metering, as in many states, will be changed to a different mode of compensation that will be based more on value. Now, in New York State, rates are pretty high, so there's a fair chance that value could be beneficial to solar market participants. So this is a big uncertainty. It's a really good question, and even though I'm ending our webinar with a question that doesn't have a really clear answer, I think it suggests that for all of us in this space, we're going to face a lot of challenging questions with uncertain answers that differ from place to place, but that hopefully will help improve customer value, as well as clarify the value of utilities in society, and will make regulators more important. So with that, I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. I want to thank my colleagues, David Littell, Carl Linvill, and Ken Colburn, the support staff here at Wrap, and we're adjourned.